Today, I'd like to go back to the idea that what informs our thinking are the stories or myths that we've been brought up on. So this is something that we don't normally consider to be the truth, that stories that we have of the world are so important that they determine our total way of looking at the world completely, and what can happen is that it makes it impossible for us to break out of that way of seeing things, particularly in the case of a story that has become concretized or literal and no longer portrays itself as a story. So it's kind of as if stories are just stories. They're not to be taken seriously. So we want our story to be more than just another story, another fairy tale, another legend. We want ours to be the real deal, the absolute definitive version of the truth. And that's what we've done in the West. And we can link the story that I'm talking about with the worldview associated with Christianity and the stories in Christianity. Which, again, we may not see that this should be the case, because we may say, well, I'm not a Christian, I don't believe in the stories that are in the Bible, etc., etc. But that doesn't matter. It's in our culture, and we don't have to be a Christian or believe in God or anything like that to have our mindset determined by the Christian myth, which has become concretized into a dogma, as Joseph Campbell says. So the key thing here is, I would say, one way of putting it, are these two things, randomness and orderliness, or randomness and logical causality, cause and effect, which we could also call purposefulness. We can also call that purposefulness because it is the same thing. Without causality, you can't have any goals or purposes, because there'd be no way to make them come about. So that would be the end of it straight away. So we'll bring this back to world creation myths and world creation stories and explain it that way, which is, I think, a good way of explaining it or making it clear. So on the one hand, we'll look at the Christian creation myth, and on the other hand, we'll look at the Indian creation myth. So on the one hand, we have Jehovah, and on the other hand, we have Brahma, the creator, just to look at the differences between the two. So in Genesis, when God creates the universe, he's not playing about, he's not fooling around. It's all very serious. It's very purposeful. We are absolutely led to believe that God purposefully creates the universe as part of some grand design. And those sentiments are echoed to this day. It's all about design, it's all about God's plan for us, and whether we adhere to that plan or not, because we're naughty if we don't, we're bad if we don't. We'll get chastised, possibly chastised by putting us in hell for all eternity, which is a pretty good chastisement. So the thing is that when God creates the world, it's not just as a kind of a random whim. Oh, I'll do this randomly, see what happens. Who knows what's going to happen? try it and let's see. No one ever created the universe before. Sure, why not? As a random act, it's kind of creative. But we don't know where we're going with this type of act. But what the hell? Just, in other words, play. What's called in Sanskrit Leela, cosmic play. So whilst cosmic play is at the core of the Indian system, way of looking at things, it's not at the core of the Christian worldview. And that's not a point that most people would see as being provocative or up for debate. Most Christians will be happy to agree that no, God Almighty did not create the world in a playful way. Some Christians will see that maybe that is the case, but most won't. There's no play. We don't get a sense of play from Genesis. It's all very solemn and serious. Now, of course, I'm not really talking about God as such. I'm talking about our understanding of what God's frame of mind was. Obviously, we don't really know, and it's presumptuous to assume we can know, but nevertheless, we assume we know, and we assume that God was being very serious, very purposeful, very deliberate, and that he's got serious plans. Good plans, but serious plans. And this is a very serious matter, and it's very, very serious if you don't go along with those plans. Very serious matter indeed, and we know that that's the whole weight of guilt, and that's the whole weight of the oppression that we find in so much Christianity, the seriousness and purposefulness of it all. No time for humour. If there's no time for play, there's no time for humour. The two things go together, play and humour, humour and play, obviously. I remember reading once that someone made the comment that the Bible is a remarkable piece of work in that it's one of the few books without even a little tiny bit of humour to leaven it, without any humour in it at all. Boys had a serious book. Now again, you can look on the internet and there's all these things called Christian jokes, Bible jokes, funny things about the Bible, funny things about. But then the thing about that is, the joke about that is, they're so horrifically unfunny. But that's the best. Within the framework, within the purposeful framework, which is the Christian way of looking at things, there's no room for any real humour, because real humour is terribly rebellious and irreverent. But there is no space for that. You don't go around being irreverent about serious things, about God and the Bible in Christianity. Well, you can do, but definitely in the past that would have been not such a smart thing to do. In the past, to go around being irreverent would be the same as going around being heretical, and you could be burned for that quite easily. So don't get irreverent. But as I was saying, these Bible jokes, because they're set within the greater context of seriousness or purposefulness, they're never funny. They mimic humour. They are an attempt to enliven things a bit by humour, because we all know we have to have humour, otherwise what's wrong with us? It's kind of a pathology. But boy, is that humour bad. The worst jokes in the world, without question. If you want to be acquainted with the worst jokes in the world, go and look at Bible jokes. Boy, are they unfunny. And that's not the case with all religions. Humour is accorded a place in Buddhism, for example, quite a core place, because Longchenpa says when you see the actual nature of reality, this isn't how he says it exactly, there's nothing for it but just to burst out laughing. There is no other response. So that's kind of the opposite way of looking at it. So the creation myth in Christianity, God creates the world very, very seriously. There's this awful necessity, and an awful lot hangs in the balance, depending upon whether we go along with God's plan or not, because we granted some kind of free will which allows us not to, but then if we don't, that's very bad news. So that's a bit of a contradiction as well. But never mind that. Randomness is all bad. There's only the plan, there's only the goal, the purpose, whatever. And that's all there is. Randomness would detract from that, because randomness would take us somewhere else, and there's nowhere else to go. It's all about the divine plan. So as a basic template for how we see the world, this is going to make us pretty purposeful. And we are in the West. We are very purposeful, not so humorous at all. We like to think we're humorous. Everyone likes to think they're humorous. It's the first thing you'd say about yourself if you're trying to describe yourself. I've got a great sense of humor. I am whatever other things, but I've got a great sense of humor. No matter how humorless we are, we can't say that we're that humorless. If we did, we'd burst out laughing, because that would be a joke. But that's a joke we don't get. We don't get it because we haven't got a sense of humor. That's the whole point. So that's one paradigm. That's one creation myth. And as I started off by saying, as Joseph Campbell says, it's a myth that doesn't portray itself as a myth. So in other words, it's a story that says it's more than a story. Essentially, it's a tyrannical story. It's a tyrant story, in that it will not tolerate any other stories. And when you get a story that is a tyrant, this is kind of what Joseph Campbell said, pretty much exactly what Joseph Campbell said in different words. When you get a tyrant story, it doesn't allow any other stories. That's bad news, because the whole thing about the story, the lightheartedness of the story, that doesn't stress anything particular and hasn't got an agenda in terms of we're supposed to think this when we hear it, or we're supposed to think that. But just a story really just throws open possibilities. Just for the sake of throwing open possibilities, it helps us to explore all the possibilities in a light-hearted, non-agenda driven way. It's a story. Otherwise it isn't a story. It's a tyrant story, which is a dogma, which is a prison. It's a conceptual prison, something we can't escape from, something we can't question, something that doesn't go anywhere apart from itself, and itself isn't worth anything anyway, because it's just a dogma and it doesn't open up any possibilities for us. So that's what it is. It's a cage of ideas. So if that's what you're looking for, that's fine, of course. I'm not trying to say there shouldn't be such a thing. It's just natural. There are these two things. There's the playfulness of descriptions of reality, and there's this thing where we concretize the playfulness and turn it into literalism. That's just what we do. That's human life. Literalism contains suffering, even though it seems to contain security. We gravitate towards it because it seems to contain security. And when we get there, we discover it contains suffering. But we've kind of lost our sense of humor at this stage. We've lost our ability to see the world in other ways, competing ways, even though not seriously competing, but they're just alternative ways. So it's like we've got into a lobster pot and we can't get out. There's suffering in that, but we don't know what to do about it. The suffering isn't. Ultimately, the suffering will be enough to free us, but it's a long, hard journey, and we can't get out that easily once we've entered into it. There's an irreversibility involved in losing your sense of humor or losing your sense of playfulness. And this is really the irreversibility of entropy, because entropy essentially means there's been irretrievable loss of information that's gone, and we can't get it back because we've forgotten about it, and we have no references for it anymore. So it's, as far as we're concerned, it's gone forever. So we've narrowed ourselves down, we've reified ourselves, concretized ourselves. And that's what literalism is all about. That's what literalism means. It means this is true but nothing else. Everything else is bad. Everything else is heresy or a lie. And that means that we throw away all other possibilities of looking at the world. We're not interested. We're only interested in our own way of looking at things. We're stuck in it really, and we've got no curiosity about anything else. So that's why it's bad for us. It's not good to be in that situation. There's no fun in it. So then the other example that I was going to give is very nicely described by Alan Watts. So I might include a link to a talk of his in which he talks about this, because he expresses it more nicely, eloquently than I do. I'm just kind of crudely going through the details of it, just to kind of throw it out there. So the other way of looking at a creation myth is exemplified by how the universe was created by Brahma, the creator god. And this is playful. And it's playful because Brahma has no plan. You don't hear people saying it's important that we stick to Brahma's plan for us, because it's bad if we don't go along with Brahma's plan for us. You don't hear that. The whole concept never arises, and the whole concept of being punished for not going along with Brahma's plan doesn't exist, because there is no Brahma's plan, so we can't be punished for going against it. Very, very different story right from the onset. Brahma is being playful. He creates the universe. One way you could see as a kind of, say, as a type of experiment, but also, and more essentially, as a form of play. Just doing it to see what happens. And in doing this, Brahma doesn't oversee the experiment. He doesn't hang around to make sure it goes in the right way. Because if he did that, it wouldn't be an experiment. It wouldn't be play. It'd be OCD, to be obsessiveness, to be control. So what Brahma does is that he splits himself up into billions and billions of individual sparks, or soul sparks, whatever you'd call it, each one of which has amnesia about their true nature straight away. And so Brahma gives himself total amnesia and splits himself up into billions and billions of soul sparks, and then all these soul sparks kind of do whatever they do. Those soul sparks are us. So I think I'm such and such a person, you think you're such and such a person. We really don't know that we are Brahma, because we've forgotten, because we've got amnesia. That's the furthest thing from how we see ourselves. We see ourselves as individual egos, individual identities. And that's part of the game, that we should see things like that, because that's the first act of the game. And the second act, which follows on from it, or the second phase, is that we start to see through. Our memory starts to come back to us a little tiny bit from time to time. We start to see beyond the literalism of thinking I am this self. And so the extreme imprisonment of the literalism is kind of a necessary phase in order for the second phase, which is the absolutely unexpected revelation of a deeper reality, a freer reality, a much more amazing reality. So eventually the amnesia disperses bit by bit, and understandably this can be an extraordinarily slow process involving many, many lifetimes, or many, many millions of years. But there's a flash every now and again. So two people could meet each other, maybe only briefly, and each would recognize each other as Brahma in that moment, which is weird, and it doesn't compute, and it doesn't fit with our normal way of thinking about things. And then we'd forget about that again, the amnesia would come back. But there are these moments, not just that type of moment, there might be other types of moments as well. What Gurdjieff calls self-remembering. So there's this thick, heavy fog, and the fog parts every now and again, and the sun shines out. So the sun shining out is us remembering, and it goes again. So there is this dynamic between remembering and forgetting, and the remembering wouldn't work at all without the forgetting in the first place. So we can't say, oh, forgetting is bad. It's you must never forget, which would be a very serious way of looking at it. But the whole thing isn't serious. It's not that forgetting is bad. Without forgetting, there can't be remembering. Without the forgetting, there can't be the play. The game of God cannot take place. So eventually all the distributed amnesiac portions of Brahma, the soul sparks that are in us, come back again. And that's when the day of Brahma, which is a length of time of creation that the world is created for, before the world gets destroyed. At the end of the day of Brahma, Brahma comes back to himself and he remembers who he is. And that's it. That was the thing. That was the experiment. That was the game. And the whole time that was happening, Brahma was not there trying to say, you have to remember now, don't forget to remember. Of course, he wouldn't say that because that's kind of stupid. But he's not there overseeing like the Judeo-Christian idea of the divinity, wherein it is said that not a single leaf can fall from a tree without God say so. God's planning, it's part of God's plan, he gets it to happen. So that's the control paradigm. Absolutely horrendous to think about things that way. Horrific. But that's the way we think about it. God would know better. That's a stupid plan. Control is a nightmare. It doesn't go anywhere. It just gets more and more complicated and more horrendous. There are no rules. There is no agenda. There is no plan. There's freedom. So freedom is the other thing. So Judeo-Christian tradition based on taking away freedom. So even though we've got free will, our freedom has been taken away from us. So if we do exercise our free will and do something that's against God's plan, we get horrifically punished. So where's the freedom in that? So there's no freedom in the Judeo-Christian viewpoint any more than there's any humor in it or playfulness. Freedom, playfulness, and humor, it's all different ways of getting at the same thing. Instead, there's seriousness, lack of freedom, lack of humor, lack of playfulness. And it sounds like I'm disrespecting lack of freedom, lack of humor, lack of playfulness, but I'm not, because that's a necessary condition. It's part of the ongoing dynamic. You can't say it's bad, because if I say all that kind of stuff's awful bad, do you know that lack of playfulness is terribly bad? That's a very serious thing to say. It's not very playful, is it? Judgments are never playful. Opinions are never playful. Anything the thinking mind does is never playful. The thinking mind cannot be playful. It's just got its old categories and slamming things in the categories, saying this is this and that is that. Completely lacking in irony, completely lacking in any lightness of touch. And that's how thought is. Thought is a machine. That's how it works. It's not that we should have this absurd idea that thought should be different. It couldn't be different. But the thing is that we should see thought for thought and see what it is and realize that thought isn't everything, and that there is playfulness, and that there is creativity, and that there is freedom. And somehow we appreciate the freedom and the playfulness and the creativity by having it absolutely robbed from us. It kind of accentuates it, or makes the virtue inherent in freedom and playfulness and creativity and humor. It becomes so much clearer, that virtue, in contrast to the ignorance of seriousness and purposefulness. So just like I keep on saying, we're not rejecting that particular worldview, we're just holding it in contrast to the playful way of looking at things. Okay, thanks for watching.